Dwayne Lessner back again for another Nutanix Cloud Clusters video. This time we're going to be showcasing connecting our Nutanix Cloud Cluster virtual machines to native Azure services. The Azure service that we're going to use today is Azure MySQL. It could have been any Azure service. This just happens to be one that we have selected today. So let's dive into the architecture. We've deployed an AOS 6.7 cluster in Azure. We've deployed it with using flow gateways that are set up in high availability mode. This is an easy way to provide all of the Nutanix VPCs a way to advertise the routes to the rest of the Azure environment. Part of that is deploying BGP VMs, which will then help update any routes to the route server. The route server, you can deploy it to an existing one, or you can use the one in virtual WAN, which we have set up here. So when we set up in our Nutanix VPCs in Prism Central, we can set an external routable address, which we set at the transit VPC level, and then add each Nutanix VPC that we want to advertise those specific routes. So this CIDR, which is in our web tier, which is a Nutanix VPC, we're going to set in Prism Central at the transit VPC, and then also at our Nutanix VPC. This will basically say, hey, look at me to the rest of your Azure environment, so that native Azure services, or maybe you have a connection from on-prem, will be able to route to these Nutanix workloads, even though we're not using a NATed environment. So we have a NATed environment by default, but you can also set up no NAT, which if you're connecting to a lot of services or a lot of on-prem in a hybrid multi-cloud, makes a lot of sense. So in order to connect to this Azure MySQL service, and we're using Azure MySQL, but we could have picked any Azure service here. Part of the MySQL deployment will allow you to also deploy a private link. A private link is really just giving you a private endpoint that you can hit that service with. So we just have another native Azure subnet. It says SQL, but we could have named it anything. So we're going to have our web server connect to this private link, which in turns give us access to Azure MySQL. So we're going to pop into Prism Central and our Azure portal to show how we've had this set up, and then connect our web tier, which is going to be a virtual machine running Docker and the WordPress image, and connecting it to our Azure MySQL. So let's get into the demo. Starting off, we have our cluster up and running in West 2 in Azure. This environment is 6.7 with flow gateways, which are highly available. So we have 2 flow gateways. We have BGP VMs to help distribute the notifications for changed routes. And helping us do that, we have a route server, which is in our vWAN. vWAN has a built-in route server, so we're consuming that instead of deploying one. Now, so our Azure environment is all ready to go. We have some configuration work that has been done for our user virtual machines, in this case, Linux machine running in our cluster. So this is our Prism Central that is up and running. So if we go into our virtual private cloud, so this is Flow Virtual Networking, we see our 2-tier model, the transit VPC. In the transit VPC, we have it set up for NAT and no NAT. One of the configurations you have to do is this external routable address. This is going to be the range. It can be a larger subset of what you want to route to, but here it's a /22, so fairly large, but 10.50.0.0. /24 is where our Linux virtual machine is running. And if we take a look at our subnets, we see that we have the NAT and no NAT. The NAT is by default. No NAT essentially means anything that gets an IP in this range is going to get out to the rest of Azure without having to add additional floating IPs. Now, if we go one level lower, we have our Flow Azure VPC. This is a user VPC, Nutanix based, which we've set up. If we look at the routes, we have a route. This is my on-prem environment, so all that traffic is getting routed out the Flow gateway. And if we take a look at here, this is our Azure range where most of our management is situated. We also have a private link to our Azure MySQL, which we're going to be connecting to a MySQL database that's running natively in Azure. And if we look at subnets, we have one subnet, which is 10.54. And then if we go one back, we just want to show that we've set this range, this 10.50.0. So we set it at the transit VPC level. We set it at the user VPC, and this is going to get this route out to our route server so the rest of Azure knows that this address space exists. So we'll get out of here. So that's all set up. If we take a look at our virtual machines, we have this WordPress running at 10.50.0.10. It's running Docker, so we're just going to spin up a WordPress environment based off of an image, so pretty easy to configure. Now, if we hop over to the Azure side, which is probably the more interesting part, is that we already have MySQL database up and running, just a small test SQL server. So if we go into databases, we see that we've already have a blank WordPress already configured. And then on the networking side, we've set up a private endpoint. This private endpoint allows our internal environment to get access to the resource without having to go over the web. If we click on that, it'll take us to our endpoint. If we click on the network interface, we can see that it's given us a native Azure IP that we can connect to in our environment. And now all we have to do is connect our environment together. There is one step regarding, so this is a network security group which is tied to all of the Flow gateways, which allow north and southbound traffic to our user virtual machines. It doesn't include the CVM for replication. That's out of the scope. We see we have some fairly broad ranges here. So anything inbound is going to be accepted if it's going to 10.79 and 10.50. So this is our range sitting on the cluster. And then we have outbound security rules that is going to ensure that we allow anything outgoing to our internal Azure space. It's any, probably want to lock this down, but for the purpose of this demo, you'll get the idea. So now we can go back into our Linux-based virtual machine. We have it already connected via a PuTTY session, so WordPress is up and running. We have our Docker command. We see our private address space, and then the username and password, which God bless if anybody wants to use those same things. That's perfectly great. We see the port that we're going to connect to, 8040, and so we'll hit enter here. So our WordPress environment is been deployed. It's trying to connect to our database, so it should be up now. So it's connected to our database, so we can give it a name, tadmin, and install WordPress. We can log in with our password. And like that, we're connecting to a database, which is a native Azure service from our virtual machines running on our NC2 cluster. As you can see, it's pretty simple to connect to native Azure services. You can keep your security on par with the rest of your environment by using Azure Private Link to connect to any other Nutanix-based virtual machine on your NC2 cluster. We'll see you in the next video.